Right. So, many years ago in a land called England, there lived a flamboyant Irish writer named Oscar Wilde, who was relentlessly witty, did some time in jail for being gay, and died as a result of complications from injuries he'd received while incarcerated, which is a genuine shame. Among the famous works he left behind were The Canterville Ghost, The Picture of Dorian Gray, The Importance of Being Earnest, and An Ideal Husband. But according to Smarter Better YouTuber, Words About Words, the back of Wilde's tombstone bears an inscription that begins, Oscar Wilde, author of Salome and other beautiful works. On first hearing this, I had glibly hazarded a guess that the choice to highlight Salome rather than, say, The Canterville Ghost had less to do with Salome's importance in the Oscar Wilde canon than it did to do with the fact that the guy carving the tombstone was likely getting paid by the letter. Except the rest of the tombstone looks like this. Definitely not the economy monument for modest writers. They could have carved the Gettysburg Address on this sucker with room to spare. So one can safely assume that Salome was chosen on purpose to flatter Mr. Wilde in death. For those to whom Salome's story is unfamiliar, it is based on the last hours of John the Baptist, or Yochanan as Wilde calls him, as told by the Christian Bible. An age-old story in which boy meets girl, girl manipulates boy into letting her chat with the prophet who has been imprisoned by her stepdad. Girl has a one-sided meet cute with the prophet and she's like, "Kiss me, you fool." But the prophet's all like, "You're mom." Girl begs the prophet to let her kiss his mouth, and boy who introduced them is so heartbroken that he takes his own life on the spot. Prophet refuses girl and goes back to the dungeon in a huff. Stepdad finds girl. Stepdad flirts with girl in front of mom, and mom is all like, "You are grosser than gross, cut it out." Stepdad does not, in fact, cut it out, and bids his stepdaughter to dance for him. Girl goes, "Don't wanna." "Please." "Still don't wanna." "Dance for me and I'll give you anything." "Anything?" "Anything." Girl dances for stepdad. Stepdad is, pardon the expression, satisfied. Girl remembers stepdad's promise and asks for the prophet's head on a silver platter. Mom is highly amused. Stepdad goes, couldn't I just kick your mom out of the house and make you queen?" Girl goes, "Ahem. Did the tetrarch or did the tetrarch not promise me, quote, anything, unquote?" Stepdad reluctantly has prophet killed. Girl cradles the prophet's lifeless head and makes out with it through the course of a pretty intense monologue, as you do. Stepdad goes, "Yeesh," decides maybe his stepdaughter is not the wellspring of boner fuel he thought she was, and orders his guys to kill her. The end. Now, believe it or not, Salome is kinda weird compared to Oscar Wilde's other works. For one thing, it was first written in French, since Wilde was in Paris living in exile from England when he wrote it. And unlike his famous comedies like The Importance of Being Earnest or An Ideal Husband, Salome is dark. Way darker and more sexually charged than Wilde's usual shtick, and perhaps a bit more like The Picture of Dorian Gray in tone and themes. The young man who kills himself after getting manipulated and discarded by Salome, for instance, strikes me as a lot like Basil, Dorian Gray's lovelorn painter, who gets rejected by Dorian and dies horribly shortly thereafter. Honestly, Mr. Wilde, what beautiful boy or girl hurt you? Like, I shouldn't presume these are self-inserts because I wouldn't like it if people assumed my characters were self-inserts, but you must admit the wretchedness of these tender-hearted young men getting scorned to death by main characters who happen to be exquisite-looking monsters could read as a touch autobiographical when they start turning up in multiple works, could they not? Another thing Salome shares with Dorian Gray is the power with which the portrait governs Gray's looks, like the power Salome uses to govern the people around her, is nebulous, and perhaps a touch on the mystical side. I mean, in Salome's case, the short, snarky answer is sex, obviously. And yet everyone but Herod seems to think of her as kind of a bad luck charm, that looking at her, or perhaps attracting her gaze, will lead to death, doom, and destruction. Is she a spellbinder? A jinx? A nuclear reactor? The text doesn't say, but a whole lot of people seem thoroughly convinced that those who exchange looks with her for too long will not live to regret it. And right here on the World Wide Web, there are acres and acres of handy, easy-to-find analyses of Salome that talk about male gaze, female gaze, queer coding, and feminine agency compared to the OG Bible story, and I'm sure they all have good points. I won't get into the reasons I respectfully disagree with many of those points, because it would take forever and be really, truly boring. I will take a second to point out that the most commonly cited example of Salome's agency is that she's the one who asks for Yochanan's head, in the Wilde play, rather than her mother Herodias asking for the head through her daughter the way it went down in the Bible story. All of which is not wrong, but it's a reading that I don't necessarily enjoy. Like, yes, alright, it was probably super progressive at the time it was written, but at this point in the game, do we really need to celebrate women being portrayed as abusing their power like cruel children? Spoilers, the answer is yes. and not for the reasons most analyzers of Salome seem to think it is, but we'll get there. By way of contrast, the character of Herodias, as penned by Wilde, is not a cruel child, and is, in my opinion, at least as worthy a feminine archetype as her daughter. See, Herodias' life has been dominated by powerful men for a long time. First by her dad, probably, then by her husband, then the guy who killed him and took the title of Tetrarch from him. But despite being little more to her current husband than a spoil of war, she has this unflappable dignity and knows exactly how far she can push the Tetrarch without causing him to dump the full weight of his abusive brigitude on her.
And I am your wife, am I not?
Of a truth, dear and noble Herodias, you are my wife, and before that you were the wife of my brother.
It was you who tore me from his arm.
Of a truth, I was stronger.
It is quite the balancing act, and one to which a lot of women today could relate. But for the moment, let's take a step back from individual figures and look at some of the broader strokes of the composition. Were I BSing a book report on Salome, I'd likely start by pointing out that in a non-spoilery way, Wilde tells his audience his character's state of mind, and even hints where they'll end up by story's end, using their various reactions to the moon. The prophet speaks of it in terms of dark omens. Herod's page describes the moon as strange, as if looking for dead things. The page's buddy, Nerebath by name, sees the moon as a princess, because he's in that useless state of lovesickness that makes him see the girl of his dreams everywhere. Herodias' view on the moon, at first glance, gives the audience the impression that she's pretty much the only named character who has her head screwed on straight.
The moon is like the moon, that is all.
But she too is seeing what she wants to see, because Yochanan has been menacing her with ghastly metaphors at every opportunity, and has given her a keen interest in not looking hither and yon for hidden meanings. Whereas both Salome and her stepdad show their enthusiastic leaps of moon logic in projecting some very strange things on that same impassive heavenly body.
The moon is cold and chaste. I am sure she is a virgin. She hath a virgin's beauty. Yes, she is a virgin. She's never defiled herself. She's never abandoned herself to men like the other goddesses.
She's like a mad woman. A mad woman who is seeking everywhere for lovers. She is naked, too.
Another instance of visual poetry that is more or less interpreted verbally by the characters regardless of staging is that of the three witchy colors, white, red, and black, reflected by the moon again, to be sure, but also in the progression of Salome from virgin to mother to crone in the course of a single night. At the end of the show, when Herod instructs his guys to extinguish the torches and Salome shortly thereafter, it is because she is no longer an unspoiled virgin in his sight, an offense punishable by death as far as he's concerned. This is somewhat different from the reaction of Nerebath, whose grief over lost love and innocence is at least genuine enough that he chooses to punish himself, not the girl who broke his heart. And yet, I don't think any of the things I have thus far mentioned are the reasons I found myself kind of obsessed with this show. I guess the first things that got my attention were the illustrations, first inked and printed a year after Salome's initial publication. That first illustrator was a guy Oscar Wilde personally knew named Aubrey Beardsley, who also did some infamous illustrations for Lysistrata, and whose work you may have already seen if ever you were made to study Edgar Allan Poe, an artist who described himself as striving toward the grotesque. Beardsley once said, "If I am not grotesque, I am nothing." And I cannot disagree. He could have totally taught Charles Addams, Edward Gorey, and Tim Burton a thing or two about goth aesthetic, and probably did. The second thing that turned my attention toward Salome was the silent picture from 1923, which... Okay, full disclosure. What actually got my attention was the existence of the 1923 film, because often those ancient films based on classics are surprisingly good, and they've lost their copyright, so they are easy to raid for YouTube visuals. But the silent Salome did not keep my attention, because the defining feature of any Oscar Wilde work tends to be the dialogue, most of which, wonder of wonders, was cut for the largely pantomimed silent film. Also, like the Rita Hayworth version of Salome in 1953, the 1923 version removed some controversial stuff that made the show what it is. Like the scene in which she's supposed to kiss Yochanan's lifeless lips takes place almost entirely under a very stylish bedsheet. The 1923 movie-going populace would have thought they'd seen Salome, but they hadn't, not really, because even little changes for the sake of censorship, or audience sensibility, or whatever, can make it a completely different show. And perhaps on a slightly more petty note, The Golem and the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari were released 3 years before this film, and they look way better. Granted, Salome of 1923 has some gorgeous moments, like this shot, with its eye contrast and its shadows evocative of spiderwebs, or this one of Salome eagerly awaiting Yoconon's head, like a bride awaits her groom on their wedding night. But what the hell is this? Hey, props guy, do we just reuse the flats from Moby Dick? Because I'm quite sure this is not supposed to be the Dance of the Seven Whales. By far, Salome, as directed by Al Pacino, is a heavy favorite among the movie adaptations I have thus far seen. But Pacino does something special in a way that could irritate people today, but wouldn't necessarily have irritated them at the time the movie was made. And in order to explain why that is, believe it or not, we have to talk about dildos. Yes, all right, I exaggerate a little. We don't have to talk about dildos. No one has to talk about dildos. But it really is the most expedient way I know to illustrate how art with an obvious political edge can be gleefully consumed by people on either end of a political spectrum. In this case, the quote art unquote is a cheeky little sex toy from back in the Obama years called the head of state. It came in multiple colors. Its package had an approximation of the former president's famous O on it, and this peculiar object of art could realistically be amusing to people whether they loved or hated the guy. If you were a Democrat who got hot and bothered by the man's enormous talk of meaningful change, this product was for you. If you were a Republican who thought that first thing next week he'd be coming to take your guns, your way of life, and your teddy bears, it was easy to assume that the manufacturer was calling the president a dildo, and this product was for you as well. And that is the way politically charged art often works. If your piece is just vague enough that someone who disagrees with your worldview can see something they like in it, some of them will probably think it is for them. That is why certain folks of the white-collar variety watch A Christmas Carol every year shouting, "Go Team Scrooge." That is why white nationalists can't get enough of Tomorrow Belongs to Me from Cabaret, despite the show overall being unflattering to Nazis. And it is why when the 45th President of the United States started frightening a lot of foreign refugees with his views on immigration, someone remembered and revived a musical called Hadestown by Anais Mitchell, in which Hades and his people explain why it is necessary to build a wall.
The enemy is poverty, and the wall keeps out the enemy. That's why we build the wall. We build the wall to keep us free.
And I would be willing to bet that more than one or two conservatives heard that song for the first time and went, yes, the wall keeps out the enemy. The enemy is poverty, and we build a wall to keep us free. That's why we build a wall, and get Olympus to pay for it. And what does this all have to do with Salome? Well, in viewing Herod the Tetrarch as played by Al Pacino specifically, about 5 lines in, you start to notice his delivery is suspiciously evocative of an IRL rich guy who talks a good game, but maybe wears his insecurity on his sleeve a little more than he thinks he does, and also became an unlikely ruler a couple years after this movie was released.
I have slipped in blood. That is an ill omen. That is a very evil omen. He raises the dead?
Yea, sire, he raiseth the dead.
I do not wish him to do that. I forbid him to do that. Caesar himself carries such an emerald when he goes to the circus. Only my emerald is larger.
It sounds almost presidential, does it not? And granted, I might be imagining things. Maybe Mr. Pacino is not consciously doing a bit, and all I'm actually seeing is similarities between two public figures who happen to be suffering from smug New Yorker-itis.
You say that to trouble me.
But at least to me, the words of Oscar Wilde in the voice of someone who sounds a tremendous lot like Donald Trump satirizes power in a way that I think is kind of incredible, but I'm not sure hardcore liberals or conservatives in this country would appreciate it. It's kind of the opposite of the sex toy Rorschach we talked about a minute ago, because at time of recording, a huge part of the USA's conservative brand is overwhelming self-confidence, and never for a second considering you might be wrong about something. Whereas hardcore liberals would be downright incensed at a reimagining of the man who would be president, wherein he might be privately plagued by doubt, that deep down in parts of himself that he tries very hard not to show people. He knows he screwed up really bad a couple times, and he constantly has to talk himself up to a level of self-assurance his subjects have come to expect from him.
Tonight I am happy. I am. Passing happy. Never have I been so happy.
Such a reimagining would humanize him too much, make an empathetic somebody wonder if maybe there are human feelings and motivations underneath all that superhuman ego. And maybe the fact that Wilde's words ring as true today as the day in which they were penned says something about the nature of influential men to whom the appearance of power is vitally important. Maybe they are all, and always have been, desperately afraid that if they decrescendo for a second, someone will see their bedrock of vulnerability no matter how much bravado they try to heap on top of it. Of course, in the show, much as in life, the potential for deep-down humanity counts for almost nothing compared to the heinous stuff Herod actually says and does.
Kill that woman!
The one and only quote I can reliably call to mind from Seneca the philosopher is, "All cruelty springs from weakness." And we see quite a bit of one leading directly into the other in both the characters of Salome and Herod.
Thou art the friend of him who is dead, is it not so? Well, I tell thee there are not dead men enough. Get ye to the soldiers, bid them go down and bring me the thing that I ask, the thing the Tetrarch has promised me, the thing that is mine.
Yet what makes this Salome's show is that while Herod technically gets the last word, it is the word of someone whose show of domination over that woman only serves to highlight his weakness. Because Herod cannot have Salome. He could not buy her or cajole her any more than Naboth could. And at the end of the night, she would rather cuddle up to a dead man's head than so much as belch in his direction. Even the literal last word of Salome is somewhat revealing, in that when Herod first arrived on the scene, his language toward his stepdaughter was infantilizing in a genuinely unsettling way.
I have here a wine that is exquisite. Caesar himself sent it me. Dip into it thy little red lips, that I may drain the cup.
I'm waiting until my slaves bring perfumes to me and the 7 veils. Take off my sandals.
Ah, you are going to dance with naked feet. 'Tis well. Oh, 'tis well, you little feet.
But by the end, he suddenly sees her center stage, taking up space as a woman, and he cannot stand it. So I guess I was mistaken before when I carelessly dismissed Salome's agency. Maybe it is totally worthwhile to look at the play that bears her name as an opus relevant to modern gender, politics, sexuality, and gays. Or gays, I guess they're both correct in this instance. As always, thank you for giving these videos a shot. If you saw something you liked, consider giving this video a shot. If you saw something you hate, feel free to try to make the internet a smarter place in the comments. Until we meet again, take it easy. Loves you. Bye.